Hi, welcome. Thank you for joining us for this month's Solutions of Change monthly mental health moment. This month, we're talking about depression and the journey back to the light. So, let's talk about what depression is, what causes depression, and some methods and strategies to address depressive symptoms. Let's get started. So, the first question is, what is depression? Now, as human beings, we all experience some type of sadness on our journey. It's a natural human emotion that we feel when something doesn't go our way, with disappointment, with loss, with grief. So it's important for us to remember that it's okay for us to feel sad. However, when we talk about depression, we're talking about persistent feelings of sadness, persistent depressive symptoms. That includes the loss of interest in things that may have previously given us joy. And then also our ability to isolate from our family members and friends and people that we love who we usually connect with. Another sign of depression is our inability to function on a daily basis. And so that means things like getting out of bed or getting in a shower or getting dressed or going to work, things that you would do on a normal daily basis, you have difficulty with them. So when we talk about clinically significant depression, we're talking about something that has impacted our functionality, our ability to be able to do the things that we normally do. Many of us have predictable behaviors, right? And it's just because of the people that we are. Say that you are a person who enjoys being around a lot of people, having conversations, hanging out with friends or family members, and you recognize that over a period of time you have isolated yourself, that you're not engaging with those people that you normally connect with or talk to. That could be a sign of depression. Additionally, when our thoughts seem very dark and sad, that we can't get out of a space where we are connected to the worst possible scenario when it comes to something, or that we focus on the negative thing in all of our interactions and all of our experiences, those can also be signs of depression. And so it's important that, as usual, that we do a self assessment. We're assessing ourselves to say, is this like me? Is this my normal behavior? And as we start to recognize things that are outside of our normal behavior, which is unique to the individual, then maybe we start asking the question like, what is causing this? Why do I feel like I can't get out of these feelings? And again, sometimes those are signs of depression. Crying, or an inability to sleep, or irritability, or feelings of hopelessness or despair or guilt. All of these things, if they're a consistent part of the way that we think, can be signs that we're dealing with a bout of depression. So, what causes depression? Now, there are many things that cause depression, and we can give examples, and I'll give you some examples of things that cause depression, but it's important that we remember that each person is unique. And so, something that may cause me to be depressed may not cause you to be depressed. It's important that we go back to that idea of self exploration and knowing ourselves well so that we can recognize when things in us change. If we start to experience depressive symptoms, maybe they're related to a chemical imbalance in our brain, and that affects the way that our nerves grow and make new connections. And sometimes, if it's slow, it can have an onset of those depressive symptoms, things like genetics and learned behavior. So, when we think about genetics, we want to make the connections between the experiences of those who are in our family tree and the experiences that we have, because we are connected through genetics. In this, when we have conversations about the mental health and well-being of our family members, it gives us some insight that allows us to recognize symptoms of a mental health concern early on, because we've had an education from those who have come before us that says, yes, this is something that is common in our family, and this is what it looks like, or this is what it's looked like for that person. So if we start to feel that, we have a notion already that says, oh, maybe that's depression. And we're more likely to get help if we can identify what something is. The tricky thing about depression is that sometimes we can be depressed for long periods of time and not recognize that we're actually dealing with depressive symptoms. We may feel like things have just changed. Sometimes we're so disconnected that we don't even recognize the change in ourselves, but we really do see the negative aspects of all the things that are happening around us. When we talk about learned behavior, this is the idea that, say that you are someone who's raised by a parent who experiences persistent depression, and you recognize those behaviors as a part of normalcy because it's what you're used to. And so maybe your parent sleeps long periods of time or doesn't sleep at all, or focuses on the negative in the experiences that everyone is having around them, or has difficulty with crying or irritation. A lot of these depressive symptoms that we see in adults transfer to children as just what they think is normal. And so it's important that we recognize that there's the potential for the depressive symptoms that belong to a caregiver to be able to pass those symptoms on as learned behavior to those who are watching us and learning from us. Stress. Stress is a huge one. We talk a lot about stress and the impact that it has on our ability to function. There's going to be stress as a part of our journey, right? We're going to experience things that cause us to be stressed, whether it's positive stress or negative stress. It's important that we have stress management strategies implemented into our daily functionality. We want to make sure that we are addressing stress as it arises, and we're asking ourselves if there's more that we can do with those feelings. Sometimes stress is just stress, and maybe it's an event or a necessity or something that you have to do that's a requirement of you. That's stressful, and you get through it, and you look back and you say, I did that. I did a good job at getting through that, even though it was difficult. Sometimes what happens with stress is that it compiles. We pile it on thick. There's one stressful thing happening in our family. There's another stressful thing that's happening with school or work. There's another stressful thing that's happening within us because we're transitioning into, a new job or a new point in our life, a new relationship. And sometimes that stress just becomes a little overwhelming. What depression does, and the connection between stress and depression, is that sometimes we feel the need to, or our brain does, or our heart does, or our emotions feel the need to turn off because the stress has been so difficult for us. So if we're managing that stress, the hope is that we don't get to the place where we're overwhelmed and it causes us to kind of turn off our emotions in a way that says, I have to create a protective barrier between me and all the things that are stressing me. And so we kind of turn off our light a little bit. Other things that can cause can cause depression include personality and temperament. Now, everybody knows who Eeyore is, and his little gray self would walk around and talk so negative and so sadly, and he was very melancholy. And sometimes that's people's personalities, and whether it is just who you are or learned behavior from people who have been examples for you, sometimes that is kind of normal for a person. When it becomes so impactful that it interrupts our functionality, that it becomes persistent feelings of sadness, that it becomes something that we don't feel like we can manage, then maybe it's not a part of our personality, but something that needs to be addressed that's more closely related to depression. And so if you are a melancholy person, by all means be melancholy. But if it hurts you, if it's frustrating, if it causes you issues and limitations within your functionality, then it's probably time to seek help. One other thing, or a couple of other things to talk about that are related to depression, include trauma, right? We talk a lot about trauma and the impact that trauma has on us. Trauma can show up as many different things. The trauma is related to who the person is, because something that is traumatic for one person may not be traumatic for another. I like to use the example of loss when it comes to the death of a loved one. There are people who recognize loss as a part of the human experience. And when someone that they care about passes away, they say things like they lived a good life, they enjoyed their family, they've gone on to glory, to a place where they can find peace. And some people have have come to terms with the idea that it's just a part of life, and they grieve in a way that is almost joyful. And there are some people who recognize the loss of a loved one as the complete disconnect from that person, from someone who may have been supportive to them, have been loving to them, or someone who has left things unresolved. And so maybe there are conversations that we feel like we should have had, or things that we feel like we shouldn't have done or said. And we find ourselves in a place where we can't communicate that anymore. And so, in that way, someone who experiences in the way where they feel like it's a part of life, it's a part of their journey, and it's okay, might not find the loss of a loved one as something traumatic. Someone who experiences it as a loss, a devastating loss, in a way that there are things that are undone, or there is a connection that is broken, may experience depression as a part of that trauma because it's something that they can no longer control. They may not be able to see what we call the silver lining of it. And so it's important that we recognize that some of those stressful life events, like loss, can impact us in a way that causes depression. Other things are transition, whether it's transition in a relationship or in a new job or in your education. A lot of those things cause stress. Sometimes when we fail at something, it becomes overwhelming because the idea is that it's finite, that there is nowhere from here if there's a failure. When we start to look at failure as a part of our experience, just maybe the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, it becomes easier to manage the idea of failing or not quite meeting the goal that you had set for yourself. And so when we're experiencing some of these stressful life events, it's important that we look for those symptoms that say, this has gone from a part of my journey or a part of my experience to something that has caused me to feel depressed. And if I'm feeling depressed, the next question is, what do I do with that? In the same way that there are many things that cause depression, there's also many ways to treat depression. One of the things that I encourage people to do when they recognize that they're depressed, and even if it's a slight depression, something that feels very short-lived. Sometimes it's good to fake it until you make it. And what that means is that we are going through the motions to remind our bodies and our minds about what functional looks like for us. If I know that going to the gym helps me stay positive and helps me stay feeling well, whether it's physically or emotionally, then even if I don't feel like it, faking it until I make it means that I'm going to force myself to do those things that I know have previously helped me and been a part of my positive outlook on life. I'm going to do those things in an effort to bring those feelings back. So now I'm exhibiting behaviors that I know are connected to my happiness, to my peace, to my joy, to things that make me feel like I'm actively participating in life. It doesn't mean that that's a quick fix, right? But this is something that we can do for ourselves. Additionally, people who are experiencing depression should always seek help. I talk about help seeking behaviors in every video because it is such an important part of the way that we manage our mental health concerns. If we find ourselves stuck in our heads with all the negative thoughts and we don't let them out, we don't release them, we don't share them, we don't experience a release of that type of tension and pressure, it becomes unbearable at some point. So it's important that we're looking for assistance, looking for people who can assist us, like therapists or support groups or a psychiatrist or a psychologist, someone who can do an assessment of us and say, based on what you've told me, yes, this is depression. And these are the things that we're going to do to address it. In some cases, addressing depression can use medication. And of course, this is something that is based on the individual's need and what their want is, right? Not everybody feels comfortable taking medication, but there are benefits to it when you are working closely with your doctor to ensure that the dosage is right, that the medication is right, that it's working for you, that the side effects aren't too extreme. And so we want to make sure that we're communicating our wants, our desires, our needs for our journey back to the light when we're talking to our therapists, when we're talking to our doctors, when we're getting information from support groups and sharing our story. Those are some of the ways that we treat depression. Other things can be looking at what we are inserting into our life, right? So, whether there is an issue with drugs or alcohol, substance abuse of any kind, whether there are dysfunctional relationships that are abusive, or whether we are surrounded by people who are not supportive. Now, it's important to also remember that during the time where we are stuck in kind of those depressive symptoms, sometimes things that are meant to sound positive to help us sound negative, because our perspective is that everything that is happening around us is negative because we're stuck in this place of depression. And so it is important for us to find ourselves in a space where we can listen and process. It doesn't mean that a switch goes off and we're like, yes, you're absolutely right, I'm going to jump up and make changes, because depression is difficult. But as we're listening to our support systems, those that we know are there to help us, sometimes we hear those little signals that say, oh, okay, I do need help. Like when someone says to you, you're very irritable. I can't say anything to you without you snapping at me or having an attitude. Okay, am I very irritable? Yes, I am. I do recognize that I've been snapping off, and it's important that we're doing that. So we're asking ourselves the question. We don't have to take it as fact just because someone says it, but internalizing it and processing in a way that asks ourselves the question, is this really what's happening with me? When we're thinking about our support system can be of great help during bouts of depression. Our support system can help us recognize that we're actually exhibiting depressed behaviors, because again, in depression, sometimes we don't even recognize that we're depressed. They can also be those people that help insert some of that positivity, things that we're used to doing. So when your friends are calling you 15 times in a row and saying, wait a minute, we're supposed to be hanging out, whether we're going to watch movies on the couch or go somewhere that we all enjoy, we're supposed to be doing something good. And so sometimes we need to hear that. And also, it's important for our support system to understand that as you're dealing with depression, sometimes those behaviors, the irritability, the sadness, the hopelessness, can have an impact on who is supporting us, because sometimes that people feel that as they're trying to assist us, we're trying to push them away. And when we recognize that that's a part of those depressive symptoms, we start to find compassion for one another in that way that says, I know that you're dealing with something difficult. I'm going to help you as much as I can. But again, there are specific boundaries when it comes to how much we can assist, right? You want to be able to help, but you don't want it to destroy you in the process. So we're looking at some of the behaviors that we can initiate for ourselves. And again, some of those things are lifestyle changes, faking it until you make it. Also, recognizing that there's the potential need for connecting with a therapist or a doctor that can help us with medication. So there's many ways to treat depression, but as individuals, we have to be able to recognize what works for us. And again, sometimes that's hard when you're dealing with depression, but there is hope when we allow one of those things, some of those things, all of those things into our battle with depression. We have the tools to address our needs and our concerns. Now that we've explored some of those general ideas about depression, what depression is, what causes depression, and some strategies that we use to address depressive symptoms, let's further the conversation about depression and the journey to coming back to the light. So please join us on this Thursday, November the 18th, from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. via Zoom, and we'll continue the conversation about depression and the journey back to the light.